Picture the harbor as it was 400 years ago, before the bridges, before the landfill, before the skyline. The floor of New York Harbor was not mud and silt, it was paved. Mile after mile of it was paved with oysters, living shell stacked on dead shell, reefs so dense that ships' captains marked them on charts the way they marked rocks. There were more than 220,000 acres of these reefs, and they held close to half the oysters on the entire planet. This was the oyster capital of the world, and the capital sat right under the water that would one day reflect Manhattan. The people who lived here ate them by the billion. By the early 1900s, more than 1 billion oysters a year were pulled out of these waters. They were not a luxury. They were the original New York street food, sold from carts on the corner and from cellars lit by a single red lamp, shucked open for a few cents for dock workers and bankers alike. Pearl Street, down in Lower Manhattan, got its name from the mountains of oyster shell the Lenape had left there long before any of this. The city was, in a very real sense, built on oysters. Some of the shells were even ground up and burned into the lime that holds the stones of Trinity Church together. But the oysters were doing something far more valuable than feeding anyone, and almost nobody noticed. Every single one of those oysters was a filter. An oyster feeds by pulling water through its body and straining out the tiny floating life inside it. And as it does that, it scrubs the water clean. Under the right conditions, a single adult oyster can move up to 50 gallons of water in one day. Now multiply that by the billions of oysters carpeting the harbor floor, and you start to understand what was really happening here. The richest oyster reefs on Earth were quietly running a public works project that no one had hired and no one was paying for. The water that lapped against the docks of New York was being cleaned, constantly, by the shellfish living underneath it. The reef was the city's water treatment plant, and it had been running for thousands of years. Then the city turned on it. It happened in layers, slowly, the way most disasters do. First came the harvest, and it never stopped. The beds around Staten Island were already stripped bare by the 1820s. Then came the land itself. New York was hungry for room, so it pushed its shoreline out into the water, dumping fill over the very tidal flats where young oysters needed to settle. The lower tip of Manhattan today sits on ground that used to be harbor. Where there had been reef, now there was real estate, and the dredges came through and tore up what was left of the structure on the bottom. Therefore, just as the city was growing into one of the largest on Earth, it was demolishing the one thing that kept its water alive. And then came the part that finished them. A growing city makes waste, and New York had nowhere to put it but the water. By around 1910, the harbor was swallowing roughly 600 million gallons of raw, untreated sewage every single day. The oysters kept filtering, because that is all an oyster knows how to do, but now they were filtering filth, and the same animal that had cleaned the harbor for millennia became dangerous to eat. In the winter of 1924 into 1925, a typhoid outbreak traced back to oysters sickened around 1,500 people and killed about 150. That was the end of the argument. The Jamaica Bay beds, which alone produced 80 million oysters a year, had already been shut in 1921. By 1927, the last commercial beds in Raritan Bay were closed for good. After thousands of years, the harbor went quiet. The reef was still down there, mostly dead, buried under a city that had forgotten it was ever there. And for most of the 20th century, that is where the story sat. A dead reef under poisoned water. What brought the harbor back was not nature, and it is worth being honest about that. The water did not heal itself. People healed it, slowly, with law and concrete, and an enormous amount of money. In 1972, the Clean Water Act set hard, enforceable limits on what could be dumped into American waters and funded the treatment plants to make it possible. New York built and upgraded its sewage system across 14 plants, which on average have met the law's treatment standards only since around 2010, and the city has committed something on the order of $10 billion to cut the overflows that still spill during heavy rain. This was the heavy lifting, decade after decade of unglamorous engineering, and it worked. The harbor today is far cleaner than it has been in over 100 years. Fish came back. Whales and dolphins started showing up in waters that had been written off as dead, but cleaner water is not the same thing as a living reef. You can scrub the harbor all you want, and the oysters do not simply return on their own, because the reef they need to grow on was destroyed and the breeding population that once seeded the whole estuary is gone. The filter had to be put back by hand, and the people who decided to do it were not a government agency or a corporation, they were a teacher and his students. On Governor's Island, a short ferry ride from the financial district, there is a public high school built entirely around the harbor itself, the Urban Assembly New York Harbor School. A man named Murray Fisher helped create it. A teacher there named Pete Malinowski looked at the dead water around the island and saw something most people had stopped seeing, that the harbor used to be alive and could be again. In 2014, the two of them launched the Billion Oyster Project, and the name was the whole idea. They would put 1 billion oysters back into New York Harbor by the year 2035, and they would do it with kids. Here is how you actually plant a reef. It starts with oyster larvae, grown in tanks, that need something hard to attach to, and the best thing for an oyster to grow on is another oyster's shell. So the project went to the one place in New York with an endless supply of empty shells: restaurants. Around 80 restaurants now save their spent oyster shells instead of throwing them in the trash, and the project has collected roughly 3 million pounds of them. The shells are cured in the sun, then seeded with baby oysters, what the workers call spat on shell, and lowered back into the harbor inside steel cages and reef structures. Students do the growing. More than 30,000 New York City school children across over 100 schools have had their hands in this water. So far, they have restored more than 150 million oysters across about 17 acres of new reef. 150 million oysters. It sounds enormous, and in human terms it is. But this is where the story demands some honesty. Because once there were more than 220,000 acres of reef, and what has been rebuilt is about 17. The 150 million is real, but it is a sliver of what was lost, and the billion in the project's name is a goal for 2035, not a number that exists today. The oysters they are planting can never be eaten either. The harbor is cleaner, but it is not clean enough for that, and these oysters spend their lives filtering water that still is not safe, so they are planted purely for the work they do, not for food. They build habitat for fish and crabs, hundreds of species sheltering in the shell. In places they can knock down waves and slow the erosion that storms like Sandy drove into the city's edge. They are workers, reinstalled on purpose, doing a job for a city that once destroyed them. So here is the honest question, and it is not an easy one. A reef of 150 million oysters that filters the water but can never be eaten, that covers 17 acres where there were once more than 200,000, is that real restoration? Or is it mostly a symbol, a way to teach a city to care about the water it ruined? And if a billion oysters really could do the rest, who should be paying to put them there? The diners who eat the oysters, the city that dumped the sewage, or the students who are doing the work for free? I keep coming back to Pearl Street. It is still there, a quiet block in Lower Manhattan, named for shells the Lenape piled up before any of this began, paved over now, with no water in sight. Underneath the newer parts of the city, the old reef is still buried, the original filter, switched off a century ago. What the students on Governor's Island are doing will not bring that whole world back. 17 acres is not 220,000, but every cage they lower into the water is one more piece of a machine the city ran for free for thousands of years and then broke, and is now trying, slowly, by hand, to switch back on. The harbor is cleaner because people cleaned it. Whether a billion oysters can really do the rest is still being decided, one shell at a time. So I want to hear what you think. Is rebuilding the reef worth it? Or is it a beautiful symbol that can never be what it was? And who should pay for it? Tell me in the comments.